unconscious, and and that is common to everyone. And the second basic assumption of psychoanalysis that early childhood is very formative in the development of the personality. That is also common. And then third is that our mental life is really a dialectic or a conflict between conscious and unconscious, and a dynamic that keeps on taking place all the time.
Right.
So those three are the common. The rest is, is the superstructure which differs.
Right. But then my question is, and I mean, I would want to jump to the cultural aspects of Indian psychoanalysis too, because I think they're very interesting. But I don't see psychology betraying those three assumptions as well. Like, I have my complaints with psychology as a discipline, but I think they still sort of believe in the idea that, so how is it that psychoanalysis is different from other schools of psychology? And I understand psychoanalysis is therapeutic at its core, and then from there philosophical, if at all. But what is the structural difference between the two?
Between psychoanalysis and psychology?
And and everyday psychology that we like, that I get across to social psychology, personal psychology, how are they different?
No, they are much more, the emphasis on the unconscious part and the access to the unconscious is a very different part of it. Most of the psychology is much more cognitive, although it is changing. I mean, of course, in psychology also, especially strangely enough in economics, behavioral economics, for instance, is much more psychoanalytic in that sense of that they call it I won't call it the irrational, but the non-rational processes play a great deal. So that is a big difference. But psychology mostly has assumed a universality, that we are all the same. And so much of psychology is really is based on, say, so many studies of college students in America. So there are some, of course, more and more. There are much more, but that has been one of the basics of that middle class European or American man is what a human being is. So anthropology has been much more creative in that one, and has questioned that. And anthropology has, of course, influenced me also much more to move towards the cultural psychology, as I'd call it.
Personally, I have found, and it took me a little bit of a minute to understand. And my story is very similar. So I wanted to study philosophy. Okay. I came to America, wanted to study philosophy. I sit in my first class. I'm like, I will never learn how to think properly if I follow this inside the box way of thinking. What I'll do is I'll approach philosophy sideways. So I went to, I sat in a film class. I sat in an anthropology, sociology class. Eventually, I bargained with my parents enough, and they were like, "Acha, economics kar lo." Okay? So I was like, "Chalo, economics to kar hi lete hain with this false half." And then I realized that I was actually deeply interested in psychology. And that's when I started sitting in evolutionary sciences and biology and all these classes to get to psychology. But what I realized was psychology is extremely static. Like, first of all, how I cannot put a number to my sadness. I'm sure nobody can put a number to their sadness, and that number is going to be so, like, self-reports are obviously distorted. So I realized that the premise on which psychology operates, which works great for things like, say, probably consumer behavior, or work things like where mathematics could be, where numbers could be used, where you could use a cardinal ordinal approach, for psychology it does not work. And for psychoanalysis, it steers
completely.
It's like, listen, there is something more dynamic happening in the brain. There is an interaction within the brain itself that psychology does not seem to probably understand. Am I correct in formulating that?
Yes, but I mean, some schools of psychology look at that as a black box. They don't care about it. Andar kya hota hai doesn't matter. It is your behavior which is important. Whether we can change that or not, that is the important part of it. There is this big joke about the behavioral psychologist that after a couple has had made love, they ask each other, how was it for me?
Right. Is that also a heritage that is being carried because of the Eurocentrism or like the American centricism of? right? The material
very much.
reductionist approach of the entire
Yeah,
thing. Because
yeah,
I heard you talk about how there is a spiritual angle within psychoanalysis,
and yeah.
right?
But
And
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
very interested.
Well, you're quite right, because that is something, of course, which psychoanalysis also doesn't agree with. It is, in that sense, very much that is Freud's legacy also of the complete, very much suspicion of the spiritual side. Uh, as you know, uh, Freud was a great friend of Romain Rolland, who had written, an admirer of Romain Rolland, who had written this biography of Ramakrishna, and he had sent it to Freud, and and that's where Freud has said, well, that actually I have never felt it myself, but I can imagine that some people, mystics, have felt it. But my interest in religion is not the mystic feeling, but the mystic ritual, not the religious rituals and the religious, what would cause it, theology, etc. And that is, but he was not completely against the spiritual side. But of course, what happened was his fight with Jung, which then moved psychoanalysis to have complete suspicion of the spiritual side, which was then left to Jung. So for a long time. But these things pass, Freud has been dead for a long time, Jung has been dead for a long time. And my feeling is that there is also a spiritual part of the psychoanalysis, can be part of it, that normal Western psychoanalysis is, let's say, the masters, which you have to go through to get to further to the PhD one. You cannot skip that. So I think the psyche, to know the psyche, understand the psyche, is very important to get to the spiritual one also. You can, because otherwise it is often very, very much defenses and all kind of things which happen there. So you do have to know yourself. You have to understand what is in your unconscious, then to go further from it. Because then the idea that individuals' autonomy is the only important part. That what is psychoanalysis is give you freedom from inhibitions, lead your life, give you choices, freedom from inhibition. But it comes only to my choices, what I'm going to do, but not whether am I connected to the rest of the creation of the universe also. So mine is not the autonomous individual, but the caring individual should perhaps be the goal of psychoanalysis also. And the caring individual not only assumes, but demands a spiritual element in that sense. The spiritual, what does spiritual element mean? It's really love in its most elevated form. So it's that. So it's but as I said, it's not a popular position.
Right.
Still, there are, not that there aren't analysts. There are some very, very well known one. I would call Lacan a mystic analyst, and Bion, and also there are also, but
Right.
very few. Yeah.
Right.